So if you're anything like me, you can never have enough kitchen countertop space. So today we're going to be building a noodle board. And a noodle board is basically a wooden board that sits on top of your stovetop range and can be used as a decorative piece or just extra countertop space. And for this project, we're going to be using three 6-foot 2x6s and an 8-foot 2x4 that I purchased from my big box store. So the next step that we want to do is get these boards planed down so that we can work with them. All right, now that we got all our lumber milled, we're ready to get that last edge squared off through the table saw. Anytime you have rough lumber, all edges aren't going to be squared. You may have some twists, some bow. Edges definitely aren't square with each other. What you want to do first is you want to get one of these surfaces, which is called your face, you want to get that flat. And you do that by running it through the joiner, because this edge may have some twist in it, may have some bow in it, and you want to get this edge perfectly flat. The second step is you run that flat face up against your joiner fence to get one of the edges squared. And what that's going to do is it's actually going to square off this edge right here to this face right here. And that's important because when you're doing glue ups or really building anything, you want to have straight boards. Once you get that first edge and face squared, the next thing you want to do is run that board through the planer with the jointed face down. And what that's actually going to do is make both of these faces parallel with each other. So at this point, you have two faces that are parallel to each other. You have one edge that is squared with these two faces. Then the last step is you're going to have this last edge here that needs to be squared to both of the faces as well, which you run right through the table saw. So right now what I'm going to do is get rid of this snipe from my planer. Typically when you plane something, the first 2 or 3 inches is going to be sniped. So we're going to go through all the lumber and cut off all the sniped ends. So since this noodle board is going to be 29 3/4 inch wide, I'm going to go ahead and rough cut these down to 33 inches a piece. This will make things a little bit easier when I'm running it through my table saw. Now that we got all of our lumber cut to rough length, we're going to go ahead and rip that last side down here in the table saw. So these bottom boards are going to sit like that in a noodle board. Remember, they're going to be 29 3/4 inch wide, but this board has to be 21.5 inches deep. So what we're going to do is we're going to use 5 boards on the bottom for that. And if you take 21.5 inches divided by 5, that comes to 4 5/16 of an inch. So we're going to run all these boards at 4 5/16. At the same time we're ripping these boards down to width, we're actually squaring off this last edge too. Now it's time to cut all the boards to their final length. So remember, the bottom is going to be 29 3/4 inches and the top rails are going to be 21.5 inches. And I'm really taking my time here to cut slow with the saw blade. Reason being is I'm trying to avoid any tear out. Basically what I'm doing is starting up the saw, getting it up to full speed, and then making my cuts very slow. All right, so we got all of our wood cut and now it is time for the glue up. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be gluing up these bottom boards together, and these two top rails, we're going to glue and screw them down. So this thing should be pretty solid when we're done with it. And for the glue up, we're going to be using this Type Bond 3 and this paint roller, which, believe it or not, actually works really good for this. You'll see what I'm talking about here in a minute. All right, so you know how I told you this thing works really good? Well, it's plugged up, so we got to clean it out. So this paint roller actually works good. I've used this for a few times now on some glue ups. Last time I used it was on some cutting boards, and you can take it apart, clean it all out. Obviously last time that I used it I didn't clean it out good enough because that nozzle was plugged, but it's nothing a paper clip can't clean out. And whenever you do glue ups, don't skimp out on the glue. Make sure you get all of the surface covered in glue. A good way to know that you've put enough glue on is when you clamp them together, you'll see glue squeezing out. Here I'm gluing the top rails to the bottom of the noodle board. I'm going to clamp them down and then flip over the noodle board and screw in the top rails from the back side. I'll use a countersink drill bit and then some 1.5" wood screws. When someone tells you you can never have enough clamps, this is why. All right, so we got the glue up all done. We're gonna let it sit and dry overnight and we'll check on it tomorrow morning. All right, now that the glue is dry, we can start sanding. So I'm gonna start with 80 grit and work my way up to 220. And when I'm done with that, I'm gonna router all these sharp edges with a round over bit just so that they're not as sharp and it's a little bit more comfortable to handle. Now it's time to pre-drill the holes for the handles. First I'll measure along the length of the top rail and mark the center point. Now I've measured the distance between the two screw holes in the handle and it's 3 inches. So my center point here is 10 3/4. So after I mark that center point, I'll move over to the left and to the right 1.5 inches from that center point, and that will give me my 3 inches. Now that I got my center point, I can move over 1.5 inches to each side of that center point, make my marks, which will be my marks for my drilling points. Now I'm really taking my time when I'm drilling these holes. This board's a little too big for my drill press, so these holes need to be absolutely perfect. They need to go straight up and down. They can't be drilled at an angle. So as I'm drilling, I'm checking from all sides to make sure that it is straight up and down. Believe it or not, I don't own a set of Forstner bits. Those are on my list of things to get, so I have to use this spade bit. So I'm actually drilling a hole with the spade bit about 1.25 inches deep. This way when I put the screws in, they'll be sticking out about 1/4 inch. Now it's time to do a test fit with the handle, and it works out perfect. Thank God I didn't screw that up. What I'm doing here is just some final sanding, removing those pencil marks off the top rails, and just doing a final sand with 220. I'm going to round off all the edges with 1/8 inch round over bit. This will make everything very comfortable to handle, and then I'll finish up with some final hand sanding. All right, now that we got everything sanded and trimmed up with the router, we're ready to put on our stain. But before we put on the stain, we're gonna put on this wood conditioner. It's a pre-stain, and what that helps with is the blotchiness. So sometimes on these soft woods, if you don't put a pre-stain on, what'll happen is after you put the stain on, it'll look blotchy. You'll see a lot of light and dark spots, and we don't want that here. So I'll go ahead and put this on, let it sit for 15 minutes, and then we're ready to put the stain on. And we're just gonna go with one coat of stain. I got some leftover Minwax Jacobine. that I'm going to use up on this project. After the stain, I'm going to let it sit overnight, and then we're going to follow up with 2 coats of satin brush-on polyurethane. Minwax recommends that you let it sit for between 5 and 15 minutes, and you're going to actually want to put that stain on within 5 to 15 minutes. Typically when I brush on stain and then wipe it off, I try to let it sit for anywhere between 10 and 15 minutes. The longer you let the stain soak in the wood, the darker it'll be when you wipe it off. But for this bottom, I only let it sit for a couple minutes. You don't really see the bottom, so I'm not too worried about it. All right, so the stain's been sitting for about 10 to 15 minutes, so now we can go ahead and wipe it off. Now with the top, I ended up letting it sit for about 10 or so minutes, and again, this way it gives the stain enough time to soak into the wood. I'm going to wipe this off in 2 separate stages. The first stage is going to be wiping off all the wet stain, getting as much of that up as I can, and then I'll go over it with a dry paper towel and get any remaining stain off of there. Now it's time to put the polyurethane on. Now before I put on the polyurethane, I'm going to go ahead and take a tack cloth and wipe off any dust. It's easier to get the dust off with the tack cloth than it is to sand out. I'm going to start by putting polyurethane on the bottom of the board. I'm only going to put 1 coat on the bottom, being that it's not going to take any abuse or use. And by 1 coat, I mean 1 thin coat. What I've noticed is that if you put the coats on too thick, not only will it take longer to dry, but that satin will turn into a semi-gloss wherever the polyurethane is built up. Now we'll flip it over and do the same thing that we did on the back side. We'll wipe any dust off and then start applying our polyurethane. Now when I'm putting on the polyurethane on this top side, I'm being very careful not to allow that polyurethane to build up where the top rails meet and the bottom of the board. Again, I'm putting on the poly with thin coats. Now Minwax recommends that you let their poly sit for 4 hours before sanding and applying another coat. I just let it sit overnight. This way it ensures that the polyurethane is dry. Here I'm sanding off any dirt nibs with 220, and when I do my sanding, I'm lightly sanding it. If you press down too hard, you're going to start creating sanding strokes in the poly, and it may be difficult to get those out. Next, we apply the second and final coat of polyurethane. All right, now that the clear coat's dry, we can wrap this up and put on the handles. Now that the handles are installed, the last step is to put the feet on it. Being that the stovetop range that I'm putting this on has a glass top, I want to try to avoid any scratches on it from the board, so I'm installing these feet on the bottom of the board. All right, there you have it. Everything's done. So fairly simple project to make, fairly inexpensive. And again, the nice thing about this project is you get so much extra countertop space. So if you like this video, please subscribe or throw me a like or comment. And thanks again for watching.